All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. And I'm joined today by a very special guest, Dr. Erik Goodwyn, whose channel is called the Imaginarium. What a great title for a channel. I love it. Erik, thank you so much for being here today. I'm very excited to talk to you, knowing your insights, the level of your expertise, what you bring to books and stories through your field of knowledge, I think is just wonderful. A lot of people say they're character-driven readers and that kind of thing. Well, you're in a position, uh, given your expertise, to really understand what makes characters tick, aren't you? And also, you're a writer as well, so we got to talk about that. Your debut novel, though you've been working on it for a long time. Uh,
Yes,
it's out
very
in the
long.
world, right? So let's chat about all that. I'm excited. But welcome to Dear Dr. Fantasy.
It's great to be here. I've watched your channel for a while, and I love the Dear Dr. Fantasy series, and so I'm just glad that I can do this.
Well, good.
Glad
It's
to
so
be
good
here.
to be here, to have you here. And let's start, actually, if you don't mind, by chatting about your book. Tell us what it is, what it's about, a little bit. What do your, if you have a, do you have a sales pitch ready? So, give us the one of the longer versions of the sales pitch. We have time here
Mm,
on PDF. So,
okay, all right. Well, it's called King of the Forgotten Darkness, and um, it's a fantasy mostly, although there is some sci-fi elements in it, because it's a portal fantasy. And basically, the idea behind it is that you have two worlds. You have one which is a near future kind of world that's our world in the near future, where we have, through various programs, eliminated almost all suffering and war and conflict. And people can take drugs that make them happy no matter what has happened to them.
okay.
And part of the reason why this is successful is because the
Wait, I
people of
just
this
add to
world.
remark that you just put yourself out of a job in the future there.
That's right. Yes. Well, that's a statement I'm trying to make, actually, is a comment on, like, we that is our job, really, is to put ourselves out of business
Yeah.
in medicine. But I mean, people talk about that in medicine all the time. I don't think it'll happen, but here we are. And yet, in this story, it has happened. But the question is, what is the cost of that? And the way that they've done it in this place, which I call Midworld, which is obviously inspired by the Midgard idea from Norse mythology,
Yeah.
is that we have locked away this other world, and this other world is a medieval fantasy world full of chaos and darkness and magic and monsters and all sorts of things. And there once were many, many portals into this world, but now most of them are gone. There's only one left, only one way in now. And this starts with the main character, which I have on a T-shirt here, Liam,
Oh, yeah,
between two
nice.
worlds. Yes,
Cool.
yeah, and he was born in this other world known as Arentir, and he was young when he crossed the boundary into this world,
Okay.
and he was fleeing horrible trauma. His family was wiped out by rival kings and warfare. So when he got to Midworld, he was immediately kind of scooped up by the system, and he was, given all sorts of treatment and all this sort of thing. And the story starts about 15 years after that.
Okay.
Young man in his mid 20s, and he still has PTSD symptoms, post traumatic stress disorder symptoms from those things, but he's pretty content where he is. He has these symptoms, but he doesn't want anything to do with Arentir. And yet he learns that one of the family members that he thought was killed is actually still alive
Hmm.
and has been there this whole time in need of help. So then he faces this horrendous dilemma: is, do I go back to that place of horrible memories and death and chaos and mayhem, or maybe I'll just stay here and chill? Yeah.
So that's the
So
premise.
obviously,
That's the
yeah,
premise.
that's the premise. So obviously, he doesn't stay home and chill, because that wouldn't make much of a
That would
story.
be a
But
much shorter book. Yeah.
it would be very short, and it is. it is fairly brisk as it is, but that would really make it quick. But yeah, so he goes in and he encounters all sorts of adventures, and the tagline is "Hiding from your demons only makes them stronger,"
Ooh,
and that's kind of the theme behind it is that you have to deal with them one way or the other, but it's told on a grand scale because it's between these two worlds, really.
yeah.
Yeah, and
It sounds
it's
like
not
your
a simple
training.
answer.
It sounds like your training is a vital part of this story. Like, I would, is it going too far to say that someone without your expertise could not have written this book?
Well, I don't know if that's true.
Hmm.
I think that storytelling, well, storytelling itself is actually a mode of healing, and
Uh-huh.
that's woven into many types of therapy.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're very familiar with that, but there's both literal applications of it, as in, say, narrative therapy. That's what it's called,
Right.
and more symbolic ways of approaching it, which you would see in, say, Ericksonian hypnotherapy, or Jungian analysis. Both of those use stories in a healing manner, but not as directly as narrative therapy might, or
Yeah.
even CBT.
I think
CBT, quality CBT does that.
almost every author is trying to figure out something,
Yeah, yeah.
And we all have our
And
favorite themes that we keep going back to in book after book, and they usually are reflections of our lives in one way or another. I think that's fairly common anyway among authors. Yeah.
well, yeah, yeah. And storytelling, before there were psychiatrists like me, there were storytellers as
Yeah.
healers.
Yeah.
So I don't think that it's necessary to have my background to tell a story like this.
Uh-huh.
It helps in the details. I can say that. But a sufficiently in tune artist of the right approach, I think could do it too. But they would do it more intuitively, I think.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Which is nothing wrong with that at all. Storytelling is a very intuitive business.
Yeah, indeed. Wow.
Hmm.
It's fantastic. I think that yeah, every one of us brings a particular background to our storytelling, and that we can bring these strengths to our stories and they are reflected in our stories. And I've always, there are certain authors that I admire a lot, like Joe Abercrombie, for example. He was a psychology major, and I've always felt that his studies into psychology must have helped him to write those very vivid characters and very, very problem-plagued characters as well. I mean, there's some really miserable people in in the first law world, without
Yeah.
a doubt. And I
Mhm.
just feel like you're probably making some decisions more consciously then. That's what I kind of hear you saying. Most of us would make these things more intuitive, I guess, as we're writing, but you're consciously thinking, okay, this is, if I had to diagnose my character, this is what it would be. That good. Do you ever find yourself doing that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yes. And now the risk involved there, I think, is doing it too superficially.
Uh-huh.
Because even though we have these diagnoses and they've been developed over decades, they are just where you start. When you're working with somebody, you start with the diagnosis and then you find out who they really are and you
Uh-huh.
dive deeper in, right? So definitely making conscious decisions. When it comes to the theme of trauma that I tackle in this novel,
Hmm.
one of the things I wanted to make sure that I did was show trauma and recovery in is a common theme in fantasy and all kinds of fiction.
Oh yeah.
But I've often found that it's done a little bit too superficially. Like they just sort of magically get over it, and all of a sudden everything is beautiful and wonderful. And yes, there is all kinds of healing that can happen, but it's usually a very rocky journey and it's tough, or else people would just do it, naturally on their own. They wouldn't need help,
Right. Right.
especially if it's really bad trauma. And so the end point of this is not really that you just never worry about it anymore ever.
Hmm.
That's just not where it goes. It goes to a place of what we call integrated trauma, where
Okay.
it still bugs you every once in a while and things can trigger it a little bit, but it's not dominating your psyche 24/7.
Hmm, interesting. Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples of stories where I feel like the author, in fantasy particularly, has handled trauma well. I'm thinking of just one that most people know about, Frodo. You know, he couldn't stay in Middle Earth ultimately after having been through what he'd been through. Do you find that a compelling example of a character where it's just, okay, we won the day, the ring is gone, you know, all the baddies are gone and everybody's happy? No, he's scarred, he's wounded, and he can't just go back to the person he was, right? Do you feel like that's a good example, or do you have other examples that where you feel like it's been handled
Mm,
well?
that's a great example. And there's actually an example of what you were talking about a minute ago, of someone who he wasn't a trained psychologist or psychiatrist, but boy, did he understand trauma because he lived it. He was a
Hmm,
World War II or World War I veteran. He saw lots of his friends get killed.
yeah.
So he knew it on a personal level. And that's where I think people miss people who say that the Lord of the Rings ends and it's all rosy and everybody's happy. And I'm like,
No,
no,
what are you
that's
reading
not
here?
how
No.
it, no. There is so much loss. There's so much grief in it. But he just doesn't beat you over the head with it. And so I think people just superficially reading it miss that. But
Hmm,
yeah, at the end, he's it's an example of someone who didn't get over the trauma, didn't actually make it through that,
yeah.
and kind of succumbed to a sense of despair and loss that he just and Tolkien kind of gives him the out of saying, "Well, we'll let you go to the Undying Lands," but that's death. That's what
Right.
that is. So
That's pretty much death. Yeah.
if you really understand what he's doing, it's like, okay, that's kind of a dark ending, but this is where you wanted to go with it, and it feels right. It feels authentic.
Yeah.
That's why it
Of
works.
course, for Tolkien, the very devout Roman Catholic, death is not the end of the story,
Yeah,
right? So,
that's right.
but
So there is
yeah,
hope even in that. Yeah, there's hope
but it is
provided
a
by the
highly
yeah,
melancholic ending, I would say, in many
mhm,
ways. Yeah,
yeah. Well, he was very disillusioned with what he felt it was a loss of beauty and magic in the world. That's what all that stuff about the elves
sure.
leaving Middle Earth is about, I think. And that's where I won't say I depart from Tolkien on that, but I think that we need to recover that. And that kind of dives into some philosophical stuff about the loss of wonder and magic and all that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Philosophers
yeah.
have been talking about that for 100 years, but
Oh my goodness. Even Tolkien, he wrote a sequel to The Lord of the Rings that is he gave up, and I'm glad he did because I've read what he had written, and it's so bleak. It's
yeah.
just awful. It's really, it's not, the magic is gone, literally and metaphorically, in this sequel. And I think he understood that, and that's why he gave it up.
Hmm. Yeah. Weber, a famous philosopher, talked about that end of the 19th century and talking about how modern technology and culture has killed the sense of awe and wonder. I mean, he's right at the end of the Romantic period, so this is something that was frequently discussed, as you can imagine. So, but see, I think it's we'll never get rid of magical thinking. Our culture may criticize it and look at it as childish, which
Uh-huh.
has been going on for a long time. It was very prevalent when I was a kid, and fantasy was relegated to silly stuff for kids, and even people who got excited about that sort of thing and played Dungeons and Dragons were labeled as nerds. And back in those days, that didn't mean that you were kind of quirky and still kind of appealing. No, that was something you did not want to be.
No, yeah, when we were
Now,
nerds, it was not a compliment.
yeah, yeah, I was there, Gandalf, 3,000 years ago.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we've seen a recovery of some of that. Like people have kind of recognized that. So I think that's a good thing.
Hmm.
But it's still it's still a battle, It's still kind of a battle against an ideology that there is no magical, way of looking at the world, and that's part of what therapy is, and that I see in some patients is helping them to reclaim that,
Uh-huh.
to reclaim a sense of wonder in life.
I love that. Well,
Yeah.
speaking of being nerds when we were kids, Maybe it's a good segue for the standard question that I ask all my guests here on Dear Dr. Fantasy, which is, Eric, going on the premise that you are what you read, what have been some of the important formative stories of your life, going back as far as you like and up to the present? And while we're on this journey, maybe you could tell us what some of the books are, stories that might have even influenced your story, which, by the way, I don't think we mentioned exactly how many years you put into your book, but it's a lot of years. You've been working on it since the 90s, I believe. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was when I wrote the first draft of it,
Yeah.
and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing, but
We'll join the
just all I
club.
had was this passion for writing, and I just dove into it because that's what I typically do with things, and
Yeah. Good
it's
way to
been going
learn.
on.
Good way to learn. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I got so that's its own thing there, but I wound up going into what I've done over the years is frequently kind of take deep dives into subjects and just sort of hyper focus on them for a long time and learn a ton about them. And eventually I got around to doing that for fiction writing.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But if you go back to like the earliest influences, obviously Tolkien, The Hobbit, that was big in the 70s when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Frodo Lives was the graffiti of the day.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I saw the animated Ralph Bakshi version of the movie way back. That kind of train wreck of a movie. Actually watched it with my dad in the theater. I remember coming out of there scratching my head, like, well, that was kind of cool, but I don't really know what was going on. But that was before I'd actually read the book. But I had read The Hobbit. My
Okay.
grandmother read The Hobbit to me when I was little,
Oh,
and that was one of my best memories. But also read Elric of Melniboné or Melniboné, however you pronounce that.
yeah. Yeah.
I was interested in that and comic book stories, a lot of times with fantasy themes. I had kind of a weird upbringing. Honestly, my mom was involved with this sort of hippie cult. Well, not really a cult, more of a commune kind of idea.
Okay.
So we had this big house where everybody just kind of came and went and did whatever, and there was a lot
Huh.
of drugs. And I was sort of allowed to roam on my own a lot, so I wandered into the woods, and it's just again the '70s where, hey, okay, don't die. I'll see you when the sun goes down, that kind of thing.
It's a little different today. Do you have your cell phone? Don't forget to text me when you get there. And,
Yeah, none of that.
yeah, no.
Yeah, if you had a bike, you could go anywhere. Like that was your ticket to all the worlds.
Yep. Your
So,
ticket to Middle Earth and beyond.
mhm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. I remember me and my friends would wander the neighborhood. This was after we moved away from the commune, and my mom moved in with this guy who we don't need to talk about. And
Oh,
anyway, the neighborhood kids and I would kind of wander the neighborhood, and me and my other friends who were in my age were the hobbits, and one of my friend's brothers were the Nazgul, and they would
oh,
roam around trying to find us. Yeah, that was our way of playing. It
that's awesome.
was pretty cool. Yeah, it was pretty awesome. Um, we we didn't have a whole lot. We had hardly any money, but mom sacrificed to send me to a private school, so that was
Oh,
something I cherish from that. Yeah,
yeah. And they had a
and
decent library in the school, did they? Or
yeah, they did, and that was when I really started writing because they had those little composition black and white notebooks. I think they still have those.
just
And
marble
I would
kind of,
just,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. And I would just fill those things up. I would go home and I would just scribble in just ludicrous stories, and none of them made much sense, but that was just what I would do.
Huh.
Yeah. And let's see, after that, um, I was about in my late teens. So 18, 19 is when I met my wife, and we got married very young. And then when I turned the year I was 20, I got married, joined the army, had my first child.
Wow, that's a lot. That's a
Yeah.
lot going on in one year. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, and this year we actually are celebrating our 35th anniversary, so
Oh,
we'll be good.
congratulations. That's
Hmm.
wonderful. Yeah.
But my first son was born with transposition of the great arteries. It's a heart condition,
Aha.
and he needed open heart surgery. He's had three altogether.
Oh gosh.
But
Yeah.
yeah, he's in good shape now.
That's a
He's
lot for a parent to go through.
Yeah, you have to grow up quick. And the army was basically because they're like, okay, I want to go to college, but I don't have squat. So how
Right.
am I going to do this? So I joined the army. I was a cook in an army prison for 3 years, and
Wow. Huh.
yeah, so that was interesting. But that was for the college fund and the college money. And then after that, I got out and started going to get my undergraduate. Got that. One of the main impactful things that happened at that time was that my mom, who had been kind of like me and her for most of my childhood, um, my dad, they've divorced when I was very small, and
Uh-huh.
my dad was kind of at a distance most of the time. Um, so it was pretty rough when she passed away from breast cancer when I was about 22,
Oh
and
gosh.
so that had an impact. And if you read my book, you'll see that there's layers of that in there. Absolutely.
I would imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Because the person that Liam has to go rescue is his mother.
Oh, huh.
Yeah. So that's the one person who survived. But there's a whole lot more to it that's not autobiographical, layered a whole lot
Sure.
more into it. It's not just me,
Right, right.
therapizing
We
myself.
draw from what we know, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Okay.
I got
Good.
my undergrad in math and physics, and then I thought I would do medical physics, and so I got a scholarship to do that. But then I found I liked the medicine more than I still love physics and math, but the
Huh.
medicine aspect was just absolutely fascinating. So I switched gears and went to medical school. And
Cool.
once again, found out I'm poor. I don't have squat. So I joined the Air Force.
Oh, no
To help
kidding.
pay for that.
Ha.
Hmm.
I don't know too many
Yeah.
people who've been in two branches of the armed forces. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah. They, at the time, they had more of what I was looking for, which was because I had a family already. I had two kids,
Yeah.
both my boys. They're in their 30s now. So, and I wanted a branch that could offer me a place that I could guarantee I could go. In the Army, it was kind of like, well, we don't know where we're going to send you, maybe overseas. And I'm like, I don't want that, but I didn't have much choice. And this time I had a little more say. And so when I joined the Air Force, I did that.
Okay.
And I was a Air Force psychiatrist,
So you went in as
excuse
an
me, for 7
officer.
years.
You were an officer
Yeah,
this time. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I did that for 7 years. I saw a lot of war trauma,
Oh, I bet.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, treated that. And that's a lot of that is in this book. A lot of that is in King of the Forgotten Darkness. Because I saw it's not just I've got PTSD because I'm afraid I'll die. That's
Mm,
definitely a piece of it. But what maybe we don't talk about enough is the moral injury side of it, which is the why did I live and my buddies got killed? The
right.
survivor guilt,
Right.
right? Or say, um, I I say I had one case where a guy he was in Iraq and he knew he said he could see this place being bombed a mile away and he knew his buddies were there. There was six of them and he wanted to go out there and help them. And he was ordered to stand down for
Mm,
whatever reason. And so that really, really got to him. He wasn't there, but
yeah.
that traumatized him big time because he felt like I should have violated orders. I should have went against orders and went out there and helped them. Like they show in war movies all the time.
Yeah.
There's a reason why they do that because that's a situation that happens and it puts us in these moral dilemmas.
Yeah, you can
So,
see that reflected in some of the greats as well, like Glenn Cook, the Black Company. He was also a soldier, and of
mm,
course there are other. My favorite series of all time, Malazan Book of the Fallen, draws a lot
yeah,
from people like Glenn Cook or Tim O'Brien or other authors who actually write directly, not in a fantasy form, but write directly about their
yeah,
experience. Tim O'Brien was a Vietnam War soldier who wrote, the short story collection, if you want to call it that, the things they carried, which is, reflects exactly what you're talking about there. I'm sure if you've read it, or even if you
I have
haven't,
not read that.
you do read it, you will say, "Yep, that looks familiar,"
Hmm.
because you've actually talked to soldiers like Tim O'Brien who've
Yeah,
these
yeah.
experiences. So yeah, and you
Well, and
probably get
I've
a lot out of that book, I would guess too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I well, being kind of with my approach, I often will ask about dreams because I find them extremely useful. And
Uh-huh.
I've written a lot of that in the nonfiction world about dream interpretation and um, why we dream the way we do and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, you publish
That has had
books
a
in your
huge
field. You publish books in your field in psychiatry.
mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and delivered a lot of lectures on it too
Uh-huh.
to specialists and lay public. Um, one of the things that always amuses me is I'll give a lecture on how to look at dreams and how to make sense of them and all that. And at the end of it, when the questions, people will come back afterwards and they'll say, "Well, let me tell you about my dream." And I have to go, "Well, hold on here. Wait a minute. Now, you realize that if you tell me this, that I may be able to pick up stuff that you don't necessarily really want me to know." And they
Right.
laugh and they tell me anyway every time. It doesn't
Uh,
it does not deter them. So um, yeah, but it's part of that has a lot of that has gone into my fiction writing because I think that the fantasy genre is a type of like dreaming. If it's done really, I think authentically and it's done soulfully
yeah.
and not just for gee whiz factor, which there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's fun. It's
Right.
fun to just have superheroes and superpowers and all that sort of stuff. But if you're doing it more on a meaning based kind of level, like you're trying to develop a theme, like Stephen Erickson or Robin Hobb and those folks and
Ursula Le
Abercrombie.
Guin. Yeah.
Yeah, yes. Thank you for that recommendation, by the way. I've already finished the first two books,
Oh, cool.
incidentally.
Good, good, good. You read
Yeah,
the first two
and
Earthsea books.
yeah,
Oh,
and they're
marvelous.
extremely good. Yeah,
Yes.
they
Good,
are.
good, good.
They're very, very deep, and they do what I'm talking about, which is they
Yes.
use the magic as a way to express deeper themes and human realities.
Yeah.
Yeah,
They function the
it's
same
super
way
important.
myths function. And I do
Yeah.
believe in that. Tell me what you think. If that's utter nonsense, but I do believe that in some ways the myths are our collective dreams, and our dreams are our individual myths in a sense. I mean, there it seems to me some very important similarities between dreams and myths. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. One of the earliest influences on me academically was a guy named Anthony Stevens. He wrote a book called Private Myths about dreams. So
Okay.
that kind of tells you everything you need to know right there. And he's a Jungian analyst and psychiatrist. Passed away a couple of years ago. Great guy. And he had that exact theory. And of course, that's a very Jungian idea to
Yes.
say.
Yes.
And that
Very
goes that
Jungian.
goes
I,
back.
I probably got it myself from reading a lot of Joseph Campbell when I started college.
Mhm.
Campbell borrowed a lot from Jung as well,
Yeah.
and others. But
Yeah.
that's probably where I got it more, was probably reading a lot of Joseph Campbell. And I discovered comparative mythology when I was beginning my college years, and I loved it. It just seemed to open up the world to me in a way that made things make sense, and I love the aspect of it that being that, and I understand, Campbell's come in for a ton of criticism for being reductive and all of that. And I think
Yeah,
that's
he is.
fine. Yeah, he's reductive, but that doesn't, I think, take away all of the insights that there are certain things that are common to humanity all over the world. There are certain experiences, the desires and fears and joys and sorrows that we all experience, and they are expressed differently, but we have that common root there, I think, in those experiences. And stories are a reflection of those experiences. So
Yeah.
I think that not everything he said is obviously um, as highly regarded academically as some people might think, but it doesn't mean that everything he said was just completely rubbish. I think that he's been. I'm waiting for a sort of not exactly a resurrection, but a sort of slight Campbellian vindication, maybe. Like, okay, yes, he was reductive and he went a little too far sometimes in his statements, but there are some interesting insights in there, I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I think you can find that in the wider Jungian literature on the
Uh-huh.
discussion of archetypes. That's one of the things that I've written a lot about academically is
Uh-huh.
the concept, what is an archetype? And so when you say there are common themes throughout all humanity, that's what you're talking about is
Yeah.
archetype from that
Archetype.
lens. Now that word gets used a lot in a lot of different contexts, but in this particular context, a archetype is a universal psychological experience that comes from our in basically innate psyche. So
Right.
there is quite a bit about that. Now Campbell, I'm aware of his criticisms as you are about him, but I'm like you. I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater there. I think that
Right.
there's still a lot of interesting, very interesting, and in the story, like the writing expertise world, all of those guys out there that are writing these books, like Robert McKee and John Truby and Darren Marks and all these folks, talking about how to write a great story. They use the hero's journey
Yeah.
very commonly
Oh,
as a
yeah.
template. Like if you want to tell a story that's really going to resonate with people, use this template. Again, that's a little bit mechanical and cookbook for me. I'm not a
Yeah.
big fan of being slavishly, and some folks really advocate for you have to have this particular thing happen at this point in your story and all that kind of stuff.
I
And
hate that.
that's
Yeah. It's too
Stephen
formulaic.
Erickson has proven that you do not need to do that,
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And because he does what he wants and it still works.
Works brilliantly, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I just finished The Bone Hunters, by the way, and I'm starting with Reaper's Gale
Oh, cool.
now. I'm going back and forth between Erickson and Le Guin. Erickson takes a little longer to get through than Le Guin for some strange reason. Maybe the books are
Books are
50 pages
Le Guin
longer.
is a master of saying a lot with very concisely,
Yes, yes, she definitely was.
Yeah.
So yeah, but nevertheless, having those bits in there can, I think, help. But you got to do it. I think the trick is to do it with artistry and with um, some kind of from a place of authentic feeling and experience, rather than just following a pattern.
Right.
You
I
know,
agree with that 100%.
Y-
And
yeah, yeah,
you want to
because
tweak the pattern. You want to sometimes subvert it. You want to do something, you have to have your spin on it, your take on it. And that's where you bring in your personal experiences.
yeah.
You bring in your insights as a psychiatrist. I bring in my medieval studies, and I'm able to put a different spin on some of these tropes, which for some people, for some
Yeah.
reason, has become a dirty word. But really, a trope is a tool, and you can use it really well. But it is, it's a matter of also, as you said earlier, learning the craft and figuring out how
Yeah.
this works and finding the ability to articulate your unique spin on these things. But they
But it
exist.
amazes me. No, I was going to say it amazes me that people, and I did this too, so I'm just as guilty, want to just dive into writing a novel without learning anything about novel writing. They
Yeah.
just think, well, I've read novels, so I know I can do it. Well, I mean, would you walk into a concert hall and say, I'm just going to write a symphony, because I think I've heard some music. And so, no, you got to learn music theory. You got to learn, the craft. And
Right.
so that was a painful lesson I had to learn myself, is
Yeah.
realizing that I had done that. And there's a certain level of maybe naive arrogance in there. And you got to let that go. You got
Yeah.
to
I
come
mean,
in.
I would definitely not want anyone to see my first efforts at what became
Mm-mm.
the way of Adan. It's changed a lot. And a lot of that was because I needed to learn how to write a modern fantasy. And I had all kinds of great ideas about, medieval literature. Well, guess what? People aren't reading medieval literature so much today. And there's a reason for that. We're not in medieval times anymore. Times have
Right.
changed. So I had to learn a lot when I started to write. And part of that education was me reading a lot more fantasy beyond Tolkien and Le Guin and my favorites from when I was growing up, and realizing,
Mhm.
oh,
Yeah.
wow, fantasy has changed a bit. I guess I better figure out how to speak to a more modern audience too, right?
Mhm.
So, yeah, hopefully I succeeded in that. But yeah, I'm sure you went through something similar.
Oh, absolutely. And after having read Wave of Dan, I would say that you succeeded. That's
Oh,
my
good.
opinion.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
do. And I've read a lot of medieval literature too, as a part of just my own kind of nerdiness.
Yep.
I've read the Eddas and um, dove into some of the like Celtic studies and Norse studies. Um,
I saw
Found some
your Thor's
obscure
hammer
stuff.
there. You got your Thor's hammer with you today.
Yeah, that's right. I do.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah. So sometimes I'll walk by, somebody, hey, nice Helm of Awe you got there from Icelandic Saga, which I've read those too. So yes, but like, I think you're absolutely right. That you can't write something like they wrote it. It just would not work.
You can use that stuff, but
Absolutely.
you have to use it in a way that will click with a modern audience who many of them won't be as intimately familiar with the older material. They may be
Yeah.
vaguely aware of it, but for the most part, most people who are reading modern fantasy are not going to delve too deeply into the original source material.
No, but they will notice the feel of it
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
not necessarily even know what it is that they're feeling.
Yep.
And that's what I think that's when the art comes in. It's usually if you can do that, if you can draw them into a story and help them feel that intangible essence of the old literature, like
Yeah.
the just the feel of Beowulf or the Wanderer. It's tough to describe exactly what that feeling, but if you
Yeah.
can bring it in, and then they'll love you for it. I think,
Hopefully,
like you,
some will
people.
hate you.
Well, yeah, and that's Tolkien did that
Yes. Oh
amazingly
my goodness. Yeah.
because
I mean,
he read so much of that. I mean, he was an expert
yeah.
in ancient literature, New Old English, all that stuff. And but yet he didn't try to write a story exactly like that. He updated it to his day, and so
Right.
that's the key.
Yeah. Yeah.
So and people and that's what's missing from all the Tolkien clones that came about afterwards is that
They
they
didn't have the
didn't have
depth.
all
They
that.
didn't have that
They didn't
depth.
have the depth. Hmm.
No.
Yeah.
Nor did they have the expertise. They were copying the superficial things without understanding what they were doing, really, without understanding where Tolkien derived those things from. And I think that
So
there's
it
a
doesn't
big
feel
difference.
as organic.
It feels less organic, it feels shallow, and that's again, so like you said earlier, not every book you read has to be this deep, thematically driven,
Mhm.
intellectual exercise. Sometimes it's great
Right.
to have an entertaining, read. That's fine. But yeah, I would agree that what Tolkien did was of another order because of his expertise, because he was grounded in texts like Beowulf and the Eddas and so much else. He was able to translate the feel of those into a story that spoke to people in his time. And also in the process, gave us cultures and myths and history that feel authentic, that feel lived in, right?
Yeah.
In a way that I have seldom seen, if ever, in any other author, really. So it's just tremendous what he was able to achieve, and that's another reason why I love Malazan because Erikson and Esselmont both were archaeologists, and they bring that expertise into the series that they have written together that form the Malazan universe. There is a sense of layers and time and history and mythology and the sense of the past that pervades these books. And that's
It
something
just
we,
happens that the ancient cultures sometimes are undead dinosaurs with swords for hands.
yeah, yeah. I mean, how cool is that, right?
That brings in the cool factor and layers that in there.
Yep.
So, like, if you're there for the archaeology, you can see it, and if you don't give a crap about that, you're still got the cool factor to hang on to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course. They've got it all. They've got, as my good friend Iskar Jarek used to say, you've got the lasers and the fireballs, along with the philosophy and the depth and all of that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's the sweet spot that I shoot for myself.
Yeah.
If you don't necessarily see the psychological stuff I'm doing, that's fine. If you just along for a ripping good yarn, then
Yeah.
go for it. Yeah,
That is a sweet spot, I think. But the problem is, of course, that sweet spot is going to vary depending on the reader, right? Like some readers are
absolutely.
going to want more of one or less of the other, and some are going to be on the other side of that. And you're going to have some readers who are going to be, that is their sweet spot. that you have that in common with them, and that's going to hit,
Yeah.
if they read it at the right time in their lives. And other readers are going to be
Hmm.
like, why are there so many long words in this story? I just want to get to the plot, and or
Yes.
that's going to happen. And then you're like, you'll have other readers who are this is the same, talking about the same book, are going to say,
Hmm.
oh no, this is just, it's too shallow, it's too fast paced, and you're going
Hmm.
to hear it from
Yep.
all sides, right?
I've already gotten that. Thankfully, almost all of it has been very positive, but I've had some folks, and it's basically just contradicting what other people have said.
Yeah.
And it's like it's the same book. I mean, how, but whatever. It's just the
Oh
nature of the
yeah.
beast.
But the thing you have to do, I think, as a writer is you have a vision, and it is good to get feedback on your story, especially if you can get feedback from someone who is really experienced with storytelling, like a developmental editor with considerable
Yeah.
experience, and get feedback from other people as well. And take what you can from that as the author with the vision, and make the changes that you feel enhance that vision. But
Yeah.
some people are gonna have suggestions that are, you just have to thank them, thank you, and that's great. And you have to
Hmm.
say that doesn't really fit with my vision. That's not gonna work. So,
Hmm. Yeah. That's what you got to do. It's
yep,
very true.
yep. But we didn't finish
Well,
your reader's journey. I don't we got kind of sidetracked there.
yeah, we did. That's true. Let's see. Where was I? So I hadn't even started. So okay, the fantasy setting for King of the Forgotten Darkness, I actually started right after I got married. I started fiddling with it
Okay.
as kind of like Erickson and Esselmont. It was started off as a kind of role-playing game setting,
Were you a
and
D&D player then? Is that one of the big influences
yeah.
from your youth? Okay, cool.
Oh man, I started D&D when I was in middle school, and that was very first edition, like really brand Gary Gygax,
Yeah,
or
I think
nothing.
I
Yeah.
started in 80. Gosh, what year was it? Early 80s. So I don't
Yeah.
know if that was second edition or first. I think it must have been second, but anyway, I
No, I think that was first. Let's see. I can remember reading
hmm,
in the early 80s, still reading the like deities and demigods and the monster manual and the
I
player's
had all
handbook.
that, the players.
Yeah, the old Dungeon Master's Guide, it was like this thick, and
Yeah,
it
I had
was
that.
complete. Nobody would write a book like that anymore at all. There's just way too
Um,
much stuff in there, too
yeah.
many words. But that's where it started. I actually ended up developing my own version of that was specific to my world. So I went from Dungeons and Dragons, and then in the late 80s, early 90s.
Okay.
Now, granted, by then I'm a father at that point because I started so young. And so I developed my own board game based in like role playing game and character classes and all this kind of stuff based on the world. Because one of the things that I was fussing about with the Dungeons and Dragons, which is one of its strengths, is that it's generic enough to where you can kind of apply it to anything. But I wanted something more specific, like everything was baked into the setting. And so that's kind of where I went with
So you spent some
it.
time building this world of yours.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, if I'm 54, so and I started when I was 18, so whatever, however many years that is, a long time.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until mid to late 90s is when I thought, hey, I should write a novel about this. And
Okay.
the
Okay.
characters that I've developed for the history of this setting of Arantir might make a cool novel. So I dove into that and it sucked, but I kept with it. I stuck with it and I said, okay, I gotta make this better. So I kept doing that.
Good.
And gosh, the end result that just got published this year is probably like the 15th, like ground zero, complete rewrite from
Yep.
scratch. And so many things have changed, as you know, because you wrote Way of a Dan similarly, like
Yeah.
over many, many years, many, many
A lot of
revisions.
revisions. Yeah.
Mhm. Now, during that time, I also wrote some other novels set in the same universe
Okay.
of Midworld / Arantir, and they're part of the series that I'm hoping to get to continue.
Okay.
Um, if King of the Forgotten Darkness does really well, then obviously I'll have plenty of momentum to keep going. And so far, so good. Cross the fingers. The
It-
opening numbers are pretty decent for an unknown like myself. But
So
I've got nine books
one
in the
thing that
series.
people are going to want to hear is King of Forgotten Darkness a standalone, or is it the first in the series? And are these other books, can they function as standalones?
Yeah. So it is a standalone with sequel possibilities because that's what
Okay.
publishers want these days. They don't want to typically hear from a new author that you've got this 11 book series, blah, blah, blah. They're like, yeah, fine. But if the first book doesn't do well, we don't care. And I get that, right? I understand that's the market. That's the world we're in right now, publishing
Yep.
wise. So it is a standalone. It has its standalone story to tell, but it is also part of a larger series. And there's some things left at the end that obviously will segue into more. And I'm working on book two, but I have the whole series planned out. It's a 9 book series, and two of the books in the series I've already written. I'll just need to revise them and
Okay.
polish them up.
Okay. Now,
Book
can I,
four and book
let's
six.
say all 9 books are out. Can I mess
Mhm.
around and with the reading order, or do you really want people to start with the do them in publication order?
It I intend to write it in such a way that you could just jump into any one of them, probably except for like the last couple of ones, because there's so much that I'm wrapping up in the entire series. It would be difficult to do a standalone there.
Okay.
But yeah, well, and the books four and six are tied into the larger narrative of it. But like I said, I've already written them as standalones. And so
Okay.
I intend to weave them into the larger narrative to a degree, but they still have their own story to tell.
Cool.
So it's going to be more um, like the Malazan. By the way, the audiobook narrator says Malazan. That's why I always say it like that.
Oh, yeah, I know. And that is unfortunate because they didn't ask Erickson and Esselmont how to pronounce something as simple as
Exactly.
Malazan. But yeah,
Mhm.
that's why a lot of people say Malazan. And I actually started out saying Malazan. And then I got in it. I was at some point early on in my booktube videos, somebody said it's actually pronounced, Malazan. And I was like, oh, well, really? Okay. And then I apologized. And I made several videos where I said Malazan in the beginning. So the first time I had a chance to talk with Steven Erickson, I apologized to him saying, I'm so sorry, I was mispronouncing, Malazan. I was saying Malazan, like lots of other people. And he said, yeah, it's okay. I don't care.
Yes.
So he was very nice about it. And I
Yeah.
figure, with fantasy, these are made up names and stuff. So it's okay if people don't pronounce it the way the author does. It's
Yeah.
fine. We can if we can believe in dragons for a little bit, we can put up with, alternative pronunciations for names.
Well, and I've already run into that. I've had some folks call it Erentier instead of
Yep.
Erentier, how
Oh, of
I've
course.
always said it in my head. But
Yeah.
you know what? I'm not Tolkien. I don't care. Pronounce
Yeah.
it whichever way you want. Now, Tolkien was a stickler about that, sure,
Yeah.
but I'm not
Yeah.
him. I don't ever pretend to try to be like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but anyway, what I was getting at was that with his books, I think you could jump into them and it's anywhere. And yeah, you'd probably be a little bit lost, but I mean, with his
You're
books, you're always a
lost
little bit
even when
lost.
you start with book one. So
You're always lost. So it's just that's you just accept that walking in the door. So it's going to be more, I think, like that. I
okay.
don't think
Okay.
I have 900-page doorstops in my future. I just
Yeah.
I don't really want to try to tell so much stuff going on all the time because really, if you look at a lot of those, they're like 3 or 4 books. They're just sort of woven together, and sometimes it's done. And some authors can do it really well. Erickson, I think, does it quite well.
Yeah.
But in other contexts, I've seen it done more clumsily. And I'm
Well,
like,
the
why didn't you
word
just write 3 different books?
the word in the Malazan context is convergence, right?
Yeah,
So each book on its own has a convergence at the end, which is,
yeah,
the people who read Sanderson's Cosmere books call it a Sanderlanche at the end,
yeah.
right? Big,
Hmm.
exciting, everything gets together and boom, explosions and, all that
Hmm.
exciting
Yeah.
ending. But the series as a whole also has a convergence, which you're going to see more and more as you get to the end.
I'm already seeing it. Yeah, and book six especially
Oh,
wraps
book
up
six. Oh
so
my
much
gosh.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a
And
biggie
then,
because I'm like, oh, he's in this one too. Oh, and then there's this guy. Okay, haven't heard about this guy in a long time, and there
yep.
they are. They're all jammed together.
But even outside of that, the other series within the Malazan world, including those written by Ian Esselmont, especially novels of the Malazan Empire, there's another convergence of the series as well. So yeah, there you in other words, if you ever do read all the other series, you'll see how they feed into each other and enrich each other and make the whole thing the sum is greater than its parts. That's for sure when it comes to Malazan. But
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely see that. So that's when I got started. I wrote book four, for example, while I was in medical school.
okay.
I Yeah, so that and there's a whole reason for that. There was when I was in medical school, I actually lived away from my family and came home on weekends, and it was about a 2.5 hour drive. So
Wow.
I was there during the week going to medical school on my own in an apartment, and then I would come home. Well, to anyone out there who's might be considering doing that, I wouldn't not recommend it because
That's
it's
rough.
very emotionally challenging to do that.
Yeah.
Because my kids were in their, like they were 10 years old and 7, and that's a rough age for dad to be away all week.
Hmm.
Nevertheless, sometimes you just do what you have to do, and that's where I was at with it.
Sure.
But I was in a somewhat dark place a lot of times, and so I poured a lot of that into that book. So it's a pretty intense, dark book.
Yeah.
But
That's
it's
another
it's
interesting
a ways
thing
in the future.
about
Yeah.
writing while during a course of decades. You're not the same person you were back in the
Right.
90s. Do you find that your authorial voice has changed in these decades and that your interests, the themes that really drive you, have they changed? And if these things have changed, do you just let it be? Do you say, okay, this is what I wrote back then, or do you try to revise it to make it all fit, or how do you approach all of that?
Wow, that is a fantastic question. I would say I have thought some about this, but maybe hadn't put as fine a point on it as you did with that question.
Mhm.
Just thinking about, like you said, yeah, I wrote some of these books a long time ago, and now what do I want to do with them? Um, I think what I have tried to do is incorporate the journey from there to now into the arc of at
Hmm.
least one of the characters.
Hmm.
So, in other words, stay true to where I was and also where I am now through the progression of the plot and the character arc.
Yeah.
That's where I think you find kind of a nice balancing point because I agree with you that, well, I wouldn't want to necessarily just erase all of that from the
Right.
past. Like it's a big
Right.
part of who I was at the time. But yeah, you're right. Things change, decades pass.
Yeah.
I'm in my 50s, and I look back and I was like, what in the world was I thinking when I was 22? That kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Sometimes I look
It's
back
just
and
part of life.
yeah, I mean, I wrote the first two books of my trilogy when I was in my 30s, for the most part.
Mhm.
Book three, and most people who've read all three books, I think, would acknowledge there's something different about book three. Well, I wrote it when I was in my 40s, and I had different experiences and different, I think, especially reading influences. It's not vastly different, but I feel like there's a slight tonal change. I think the book three is the most unconventional of the three, actually, and
Mhm.
it takes the most risks. It is quite different from most things you would find in fantasy. A lot of people get to the end of book two and they're like, "Wait, isn't this is where usually a trilogy would end, right? What now?" Well, I'm doing something different in book three, and it's the aftermath, and it's the longest of the three books too. Now that
Interesting.
I'm in my 50s, I think I'll be writing something different from what I did in my 30s and 40s for sure. So yeah, you just there are different concerns, different priorities, different things that you want to think about, and deal with. Like you said in the beginning, writing is an act of sort of self-therapy in a way, isn't it?
Mhm.
And
Oh,
these,
absolutely.
you know,
I've had patients that they found that out on their own,
yep,
and they would not only writing, but even just reading, like something as simple as the usual example I give is like a historical romance novel. and someone who has experienced like early sexual trauma, um, sometimes they can find healing in those kinds of stories because they all have very similar structure. Like
Uh-huh.
the protagonist is someone who's been put through all kinds of hell and comes out at the end on top. And so the important, I think, thing about those stories, even though you might label them as cliche or formulaic or whatever it is, there is a reason for that. And I think it's because it does resonate with people sometimes on a deep level and helps them to have some hope
Yeah.
and maybe helps foster resilience where they're not getting that anywhere else. Right. So even in the stuff that's not super deep can be powerful and helpful in healing.
Well,
Um,
it's an enactment of transcendence in a way, isn't
yeah.
it? When you
Mm,
participate in that story and you find this character able to overcome what's been done to them and find a meaningful life beyond it. And that
yeah.
sends a powerful message to people. And that's the importance of stories. And we need stories. We need them to help us make sense of what we've been through and to give us a sense of meaning and hope. And yes, there's lots of sorrows, and no story would be compelling with if it were just all happy and
Yeah.
sunshine and roses, right?
Roses.
So it is important that we get the full array of human experience, but I think that includes triumph and joy and
Mhm.
transcendence.
Yeah. There is, I think, a tendency. I don't, this may, it feels like it might be changing, but I'm not sure. There's a lot of talk about grimdark fantasy now. And of course, Abercrombie has made that very popular.
Yeah.
Not just him, but others. And I would also say Erickson's pretty grimdark.
Mm.
Just in sense of like it's super, super gritty. Like he doesn't shy away from anything, even really awful stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but the question is, what are we doing with this? If we're just showing nonstop bleakness and grim and all that, I don't think that's really all that helpful. But you can use it in such a way that it is edifying or enriching, not necessarily uplifting. I mean, tragedies have been around for a long time. I wouldn't call Macbeth uplifting necessarily,
Right.
but it is enriching and it's a very powerful story. And it's extremely dark, and that's been around for centuries. So it's nothing new.
No, it isn't. I mean,
But
you could say Tolkien's The Silmarillion is the original grimdark if you want. I mean,
geez, yeah,
it's pretty bleak, but labels aside, I personally do not think of Malazan as grimdark, and neither does Steven Erikson, by the way. But that's neither
mm,
here nor there, really, because I think the labels disguise the complexity,
yeah,
and the fact of the matter is, if somebody else wants to think of it that way, I'm fine with that. But to me, Malazan isn't grimdark, mainly because it isn't, as you were just saying, it isn't just the terrible things that happen. It isn't, repeat, 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 tragedy, sorrow, loss, trauma. There's a
yeah,
ton of beauty in that series. There's a ton of joy and wonder and transcendence and connection and empathy and compassion. And that's
yeah,
really, I think, what drives the series is that exploration of those things, of connection and compassion, which is why to me it's not grimdark. But I will acknowledge there are horrible things that happen in the course. I mean, you haven't even gotten to the worst yet. There's
mm,
more to come. But there's also a lot more of that other stuff in there. The Particularly in the Crippled God, in my opinion,
mm,
never has there been a more beautiful exploration of compassion, in my opinion. So you'll see.
mm.
I mean, I'll be curious to see what you make of it. But and
Yeah. No, I'm
not
looking forward to it.
and there's value to me in what I see as grimdark too. And in I would say that Abercrombie's writing, the first law books, is more true grimdark in the sense that it really leaves me personally, and I love his humor, which is what makes it tolerable, honestly. But it leaves me with an overall feeling of our insufficiency, our absurdity, our we you do have characters in First Law who struggle to better themselves, but they always fall backwards.
Yeah.
There's no uh shining, glorious moment when a character breaks through and triumphs in First Law. It's really more we're rolling around in the mud and we keep trying to struggle out of it, but we keep falling back in all the time, and we all
Yeah,
go back to the mud too.
yeah.
So
Well,
I see
look
it.
at Logan.
Yeah.
Logan's journey winds up exactly where he starts.
Yeah, I mean, it's just that's there now. I don't think that though. Having said all that, I think there's great value in these kinds of stories too. There's to me, I've said for a number of years that grimdark is fantasy's sort of version of existentialism. That we live in a world where there's no intrinsic meaning. There's nothing in the universe that there's no purpose, there's no meaning, but if you care to, you can, get up and try to craft some meaning out of your life. Try to carve it out of your existence. And you keep fighting, and you'll probably lose and die, but there's maybe some value in the fight, in the struggle. So there is a kind of you could see that as a bleak a thing, but I also see it as empowering, actually. But yeah, but,
Yeah, I agree with that. The First Law trilogy, when I finished that up, at first I had this sense of, boy, that just seemed very nihilistic. But on reflection, I realized that it really isn't. Even though
uh-huh,
nothing ends well, that was exactly the point that he was trying to make was
yeah,
we go through all of this stuff and the value of life and the value of the world is there, and it just so happened that every one of the characters missed it. So in a sense, he's showing the value and that it's not a nihilistic universe by showing how all these people are missing it. So it's kind of it's a very subtle way of showing. And I've seen other and read other stories that were truly nihilistic,
yeah,
and it wasn't like that. It didn't, nothing shone through like it did with the First Law
right.
trilogy. So, maybe that's just me and I'm just seeing it, in my own perceptive way of looking at it. But I think that he meant to do that.
Something that for me gets much closer to nihilism and maybe even absurdism, meaning similar to nihilism, but there is a sense in which we keep, because of the way we're rigged or whatever, we keep trying to find meaning out of this universe, and we're doomed to fail, like again and again and again. We're like ants that keep trying to rebuild a hill that gets knocked down all the time, and there's something absurd about that. And that's R. Scott Baker's second Apocalypse series, which begins with the Prince of Nothing trilogy. If you want to read something even actually much bleaker than First Law, then
Yeah.
read the second Apocalypse series, because that one is
I watched your review of that and I thought, I think I'll give that one a pass. I don't really, I,
Baker's
I deal
it,
with so much, in my
oh,
job,
I imagine, yeah. He is
run
a
into stories of,
prodigiously talented author, though. He's just,
yeah, of
yeah,
course.
yeah,
And I think we need that kind of stuff. We need
yeah,
people to keep reminding us that, hey, it could all just be a bunch of nonsense.
yeah,
And for the rest of us to go, no, daggone it, no, it isn't.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. I mean,
And this is why.
the labels simplify things in a way that's deceptive, I
Yeah,
think.
yeah.
But I mean, someone could argue that Realm of the Elderlings is grimdark, I suppose, because there's all kinds of terrible trauma in Robin Hobb's series. She puts her characters through the ringer, let me tell you. But I don't think most people think of it as grimdark because, again, there's transcendence and beauty and connection and wonder at the same
Yeah.
time. So there, in talking with Jenny Wirtz over the last couple of years, one of her readers came up with this idea of transcendental fantasy. And I think that Jenny Wirtz's books are a great example of that, by the way, Wars of Light and Shadow, but also Realm of the Elderlings and Malazan. And Jenny Wirtz also was very generous in saying that my books, she's read the trilogy, the Adan trilogy, saying these are also
Yeah.
transcendental fantasy. What you've done here is fits that that definition. So that tends to be what I'm attracted to the most, I guess, if we're gonna spread this label around is transcendental fantasy. But
Mm.
what would be the
Yeah, I
label
like the
for
sound of that.
what would be the label for King of the Forgotten Darkness? How would you gotta put in a bookstore, you gotta put in a Barnes and Noble. Which section of fantasy is it going to be in?
Well, currently it's marketed as a new adult fiction.
Okay.
So that, that's an important label because I think people go into that expecting a more faster pace, and people that have read it and thinking that it was in more of the adult fantasy might say things like, "Well, this reads like a young adult or an NA." I'm like, "That's because it is."
Uh-huh.
But so there's a little confusion there, but that's where I would put it. But in terms of like, is this grim dark or bright, whatever what do they call it, bright sword or something like that is
Noble
another
Bright. Noble Bright. Is that
noble
what?
bright. That's it.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, noble bright. Um, well, I think that it would probably. I've not heard the term transcendental fantasy, but I think I get what you're talking about, and that's more what I'm aiming towards as
Okay.
well. Because
Cool.
I want to show in my line of work, I have people dive into the unconscious and the darkness and face the shadow and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have been through horrible, horrible stuff
Yeah.
that I have to be careful not to carry with me when I leave at the end of the day.
Sure.
Um, you know, and so there is a lot of that, and that ventures into horror. And so it's you could easily label it as a dark fantasy as a
Uh-huh.
result,
Uh-huh.
but it's not nihilistic or bleak or grimdark.
Right.
I would not really label it that. Not that I have anything wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with those, but
Right.
it's more. Yes, there is all this horrible stuff, and yes, sometimes what we think of as good is actually not. But then sometimes what we think of as evil is not either.
Hmm.
There's a lot of I don't like to say gray because that brings up this whole like all characters need to be morally gray and all that kind of stuff. I don't agree with that. I think we need to have characters who are exemplary, like Aragorn, but that doesn't mean that they have to all be all or nothing. And so instead of saying morally gray, I think it's better to say that they're multicolored.
Uh-huh.
Like there's black and white at the same time, and it's not blended together.
Right.
Sometimes
Right.
it's not gray. That's just me, being metaphorical maybe, but
Yeah.
hopefully that answers your question.
Oh, it does
I guess
very well.
people will decide what they want to call it, when they read it, but that's kind
Right.
of what I think it is.
Yeah, no, I think that beautifully answers the question, and I like your take on the characters because your way of expressing it acknowledges the complexity that exists within the human mind, and I'm sure that's something that's it's almost second nature to you at this point with your background and your training. So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, yeah, you can see I've seen folks who were um, just unapologetically criminal in elements of their life, and yet they the most important thing in the world to them was their son, for example.
uh-huh,
And so that's not gray. That's black and white. That's
huh,
dark and light existing simultaneously within the same person.
huh.
And that's a very fascinating thing from character point of view.
Wow, we
Uh,
are interesting creatures, aren't we?
yeah. Well, brains are big and they're complicated, turns out.
Yeah,
So
how about that?
there's a lot going on in there.
Yeah. So that's
And the way
we
that
are. Go ahead.
I was going to say, in the way that we perceive our world has a huge amount to do with how we feel. And I think the reason why storytelling is so important is because, and at the kind of deeper level, like the emotional centers of the brain, like the limbic system and all that,
Yeah.
they can't really tell the difference between so-called reality and imagination.
Hmm.
And we use that in different types of therapy because we like guided imagery, for example, is one technique, or hypnotherapy is another one, where we bring them into a type of relaxed, almost trance-like state,
Yeah.
and then guide them through a healing story. That's a Ericksonian technique.
Yeah.
And it's because the emotions are like, oh, okay, I can see it this way now. But you're imagining the whole thing. But it's really only the frontal lobe that worries about such things. On the left
Right.
side in particular, it'll say, well, but that's not real.
Huh.
And the rest of the brain is like, what are you talking about, man? Shut up.
Huh. That's
And
why
so
we're
it
so messed
actually
up. We
really
have different
works.
parts of our own brains that are in conflict, right? And Faulkner thought it was the
Yeah.
heart, but it's the dumb brain, all right? And Faulkner said there's nothing worth writing about but the human heart in conflict with itself. And when we say that, we're really talking about these messed up brains, right? For these different areas and concerns, and we're being pulled in different directions.
I wouldn't entirely say he was wrong about the heart bit though, because the
Okay.
body also has its things to say. You may have heard the book title, "The Body Keeps the Score." It's a
Yep.
famous book about trauma
Yeah.
that was written by a Gestalt psychologist, and I've read a lot of stuff from that guy, and it's definitely right. And the thing is that we often think of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind.
Uh-huh.
That you hear that spoken of, but it's more accurate, really, to say the conscious mind and the conscious ego, the me, the self, the what I think of as me, and the non-ego consciousness, because it's also has its own awareness and way of thinking about things.
Yeah.
And therapy involves trying to get these two to start working together because a lot of times they don't.
Huh.
I've seen folks where they had in their head, they're like in their mind, their conscious awareness is thinking, I need to go do this. That would be super exciting. And the rest of their body is like freaking out at the idea. Like I had a guy who he had a lot of war trauma and he was offered a job to be an advisor in Afghanistan. And
Uh-huh.
he thought, wow, that'd be a great thing to do. And the rest of his body said, uh-uh. He was having nausea, panic attacks. He felt like he was having heart attacks. He was getting obsessions and wanting to clean his apartment 24/7,
Wow.
all as a result of this one piece of news that he was really quite oblivious of. And so
Wow.
part of his journey was learning, hey, your body's got something to say about this, and it may not agree with what you want.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's figure that out here. And he did much better once we were able to do that.
Just yeah, that level of awareness is something you can bring to your patients, and yeah,
Mhm.
and that can be help the first step really on the way to healing oneself, I guess. It starts with some awareness.
Oh yeah, yeah. Awareness. I think the job of the ego is to rein in all the chaos. But sometimes we get caught up in things and we do more harm than good.
Hmm.
As a therapist, I don't ascribe to the idea that I am going in and I'm fixing you
Right.
somehow. It's not really like that. And in fact, in medicine in general, it's not really like that.
Hmm.
The body has its own healing mechanisms. And like the immune system, obviously everybody knows about that, but the mind has its own kind of immune system too. So a lot of therapy involves helping them get in touch with those kind of more healing mechanisms that are, for whatever reason, have been oppressed or repressed or whatever.
Right.
Um,
Right.
you
By,
know,
by
so I can just think
trauma
about like,
experience. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So PTSD is a great example. If I'm experiencing those symptoms, it's basically because I still think on some level, even though like intellectually I know that's not happening to me right now, the rest of my body thinks it is. And
Yep.
like the limbic system thinks it's still happening.
Hmm.
And this because a natural healing process of taking a super emotional event that needs all those defenses to kick in has not undergone its usual healing process.
Hmm.
Normally, those memories go from super emotional to a more abstract, kind of distant memory. Like, oh yeah, I remember that thing happened to me and that was rough, but I don't feel like it's happening to me now. It's in the
Right.
past where it belongs. So therapy involves a lot of times getting us to that state to where we don't feel like it's happening right now.
Right.
I
Right.
got some really interesting feedback from King of the Forgotten Darkness. He sent me a message saying, I've got a lot of trauma in my history, and this is the first time I've read a book that's describing my experience in like the first chapter.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm like, well, good. That means I did what I was supposed to be doing. But of course, the point of it is not just to do that, but to guide to cathartic healing endpoint.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, while being entertaining at the same time. It's
Yeah. That sounds like a
yeah.
great combo to me. Wow. I
Well,
hope
that's the
that
idea.
readers will find real value in that kind of storytelling, I am sure. And of course, I'll be supplying a link not only to your channel, but where can people buy King of the Forgotten Darkness? What's the best way for them to pick up a copy, and what kinds of formats do you have it available in?
It is available on paperback and in digital format.
Okay.
They it should be in bricks and mortar stores as well. You can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all of those outlets. If it's not in a local bookstore, you can easily have them order it for you, and they'll get a copy for you.
Okay.
Or you can just download it digitally. I'll send a link
Okay. Very good.
as
Yeah.
well to the, yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So that is just wonderful. Thank you also for spending your time with me here today. What last thing is what can viewers expect? People who head over to the Imaginarium, what can they expect to find on your channel, and what will you be doing there in the future?
So on that channel, I do have lots of reviews of fantasy and some sci-fi and horror as well, because I think they're all kind of interconnected. And I get into that in a couple of videos. More recently, I've been doing a few more like book reviews, but I also am I have a series on dream interpretation techniques,
Cool.
a lot of stuff about Jungian psychology and mythology, and I talk about like everyday mental health stuff as well, more like practical techniques to help people who are dealing with anxiety or trauma or low self-esteem. For example,
Huh.
it's one of my popular videos. My most popular video is probably the one where I ask the question, are dream characters conscious? So that's I dive into some of the science here too.
Oh,
What
cool.
studies have been done? It's a really weird study. It was done in the 80s, and it's my most popular video. I had no idea it would be like that.
Huh. Huh.
And I look at it now and I'm like, gosh, this video is just not very good quality, and yet
Oh, yeah.
people still watch it. Yeah.
I know
So
that
I mean, this
feeling.
is the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so
So,
all of that stuff, I talk about fantasy narratives and fiction as well as the intersection between that stuff
okay.
and the mind.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful place. But do you have any of these organized into like playlists or something like that? Or is it, yeah?
Yeah, I do. There's a playlist called Mental Health Mondays where I talk more about the practical stuff,
Okay.
mental health stuff. And then there's Fantasy and the Psyche, where I dive into more the way that fiction and the stories we tell ourselves intersect with real world, so-called real world, realities about the way the mind works, the brain, all that.
Cool.
And then I have a whole series. Like if you want to go to my website, you get access to a 10-part series in interpreting dreams.
Oh, cool.
This whole process I go through. Yeah.
Give me that link too then. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I will.
Cool.
Definitely.
That is awesome. So that's what you can find over at the Imaginarium. It sounds fantastic. Eric, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I really enjoyed chatting with you and hearing more
It's
about
been
the
an,
Forgotten Darkness. Yeah.
yeah, it's been an immense pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Ah, great. Good to hear. And once again, Eric's Dr. Goodwin's links will be in the description. I do highly encourage you to check out his channel. And there will be links, of course, to the King of Forgotten Darkness as well. But thank you, everybody, for watching, and we'll see you next time.